Welcome to the Roworx Legacy Podcast, a podcast that inspires and motivates individuals through personal stories from Olympians and athletes of all backgrounds. Each week, we will be delivering interviews about various athletes' true backgrounds and what made them who they are today. This podcast will focus on what identity these competitors have adopted and what they would like their legacy to be. We're going to offer some hard-hitting and inspiring stories of great athletes and what it takes to be the best. Now here's your host, Ironman competitor and national team rower, Jack Nunn.
All right. So, hello everybody. Welcome to the Roworx Legacy Podcast. We're here with legend kayaker, Olympian Cliff Meidl, 1996 and 2000 Olympic kayaker. You probably recognize him from carrying the flag at the opening ceremonies at the 2000 Sydney Olympic Games. Cliff is a good friend of our family, fellow Olympian of my father, great friends with our family. And welcome, Cliff. We're very excited as in this episode number 3 in the beginning of this journey for podcasting and just for getting people to really appreciate sport and the legacy it leaves. Welcome, Cliff Meidl. Thanks for being with us.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so we're going to start right off the bat and just tell the listeners, where did you grow up, and tell us about your childhood and how you got into sport.
Well, Manhattan Beach, California, here in Southern California. I grew up, doing what a lot of the kids do down here, board shorts and flip-flops, beach life activity. I had very active parents growing up. They were very I got older, I started getting engaged in other various things, especially the sports that came through. With high school, I did a little bit of track and field, ran cross country, and basically did a lot of sports like that, tapped into a little bit of the gymnastics. But, most of my stuff was beach-oriented stuff, did some skateboarding, was on the water a lot, and I really enjoyed it. It was a big part of my life living here in Southern California.
Awesome. Yeah. I currently live in Manhattan Beach. Actually, a lot of people mistake that I live in Long Beach. I should, because my business is there, Roworx indoor rowing. But Manhattan Beach is a childhood dream. It's such a great atmosphere, and all of Southern California, really. And moving on, what do you love most about the sport of kayaking?
I think that, the biggest love is obviously the being out on nature and being able to be, in that beauty. There's a lot of, I always say with some friends of mine, we've seen more of the coastline, especially the Manhattan Beach, Marina del Rey, that whole South Bay coastline. I've seen much more of it from the water to shore than I have from shore to water. So, that provides me an enormous amount of gratitude.
One of the things that really resonated with me was when you said how you really appreciate after a workout, you see the sunset and you feel lucky to be one of the few to be at the elite level, to train and to compete at that level, and just to be alive and in general. And I remember in Ironman training and also in rowing, a few speakers before our races were reminding us, hey, last but not least, have fun out there. You're here to compete, but have fun and enjoy the process and be grateful for you're the less than 1% that gets to do this physically and mentally and just be proud of your accomplishments. And that really resonated with me. And that race, that was in Wisconsin, actually, in Madison. And that race, and it was on my birthday. And I was like, you're right. And I had the best time that race, and it really reminded me every day. So that when you said that, it really resonated with me. And I think to all the listeners out there, to really be grateful of what you have and to enjoy the process. So I think that's a great message. And how did you find kayaking? How did you get into it?
Well, the funny thing was that when I was in high school, I was a very scrawny kid, very thin built, but I had an incredible, I think that if I was to unpeel the onion and kind of step aside on what your question is, I think that, if I was to look back and say, what did Cliff Meidl have? What is one of my strongest skill sets? It was definitely to dream big. I was always a big dreamer. Whether I was going to accomplish the dream or not, that really wasn't into the formula at that time. But I always dreamt big, and I always really grabbed on to my mentors and those people out there that created a lot of influence. And I think that as a young child and as a young adult, I really utilized that mentorship well. I didn't understand it at the time what it was, but it was something that my personality really grabbed onto a lot. So I was very influenced by my mentors. And it just so happened to be that a best friend of mine got invited to go down to canoe paddle for this club in Redondo Beach. It's called Lanakila. It means determination in Hawaiian. And so he got invited to go down there, and I was totally bummed out. I was a skinny kid. So I would, after practice, I would just sit on the dock and watch all these guys that I knew in high school paddle this canoe until one day, I remember my coach, totally ripped up guy, he's all buff and everything, very intense guy, and turned out to be one of my most incredible coaches that I've had, very influential for me at the time of my life. And this one kid didn't show up. So he looks up at me with a little bit of hesitation and says, "Hey, Cliff, we need somebody to fill the seat here in seat 5. It was a 6-man outrigger canoe. And so I was very intimidated, but I jumped into the boat, and I developed a love for the sport from day one right there. And it turned out that this little skinny kid was able to really apply himself and adapt and blend well with that team sport environment. I wasn't the buffest kid. I was very skinny, but in our sport, we learn a lot that, it's all about being able to blend with your team, and it's all about the water and power application that you have in the water. So long and short of it, it started off there. I raced the whole season in 1983 with the 16 and under team. And that's where I got introduced to paddling, but there was a little bit of a hiatus when I ultimately got back into paddling a few years down the road.
Right. And for the listeners again, we talked about this before the show, and how people conflict or compare rowing to kayaking, and it's totally different. Canoeing, totally different. Now it's similar in some motions, the catch and stuff like that, but the application of power and speed is just a different mechanism and different things going on. And even kayakers will tell rowers, "No, you'll get it," like they did to me when I tried out for different kayaking things and different practices, and then they quickly realized, oh, Jack does not get it. So it's definitely a different motion. Yeah. So for people out there, it's in respectfully that way. It's such a difficult stroke to master. Just like anything, I tell people, like tennis, baseball. These are all strokes. Golf is a good one. People know how difficult those are. So you just keep practicing that stroke over and over. And moving forward, what do you feel like your greatest achievement is, or your most defining sport moment means the most to you, and why?
I think that, I have a couple of them. I have some of them that affected me a little bit different emotionally. I can tell you one of them definitely was when we talk about sport moment, it was within the sport. I had one of the most incredible honors at the Sydney Olympics. I was elected to be the flag bearer for Team USA. So for me, that was a chilling and honorable experience. And I remember standing there, and I tell this story often. I was standing there ready to enter the stadium. My heart is beating out of my chest. I walk like Bambi because I had lower leg limitations because of an accident. We can talk about that a little bit later. But here I am standing there. This lady's screaming into my ear, "Okay, Cliff, get ready, Team USA." And I'm standing there with this aluminum pole, standing there, and I'm thinking to myself, oh my goodness. And I remember taking this really deep breath because I was so nervous. And as everybody knows, we're all competitors. And we've all had our nerves going, especially as doing all the different triathlons and your rowing experience, that you have these nerves going, but I believe they're important to have them. It's that competitive spirit that makes you want to go out there and compete at your highest level at all times. And here I was, nervous as heck, 2 billion people watching on TV. The opening ceremonies for the Olympic Games, I look up into the grandstands, and there's Bill Gates, waving his American flag, and all these different people in the audience. And I remember, I thought to myself, Cliff, whatever you do, don't trip, right? I walk with a limp. And So what I did is I took this deep breath and I turned around and I looked over my left shoulder, and the only thing I could see for a quarter of a mile was a sea of red, white, and blue. And it was the entire United States delegation that was standing behind me. The 500, 600 odd Olympic athletes and the greatest in the world were standing behind me. And I was chosen to be able to carry the flag and represent our country. And that by far was the most proud moment that I had in my sporting career. And I would say that would be the pinnacle, in addition to being honored, as we all are, to be American, representing the flag and being able to be in that highly unique situation of being able to represent our country at an Olympic Games. So I think that on an honored level, that was by far, did I win an Olympic medal? No, we're a very European dominated sport. So I never was able to win an Olympic medal, but I think that my medal at that time was the distinguishment being in this club of flag bearers. There's only one of them. Well, there's an opening and a closing flag bearer, but we're such a limited alumni throughout the history of the Olympic Games. And, a lot of weird things came together during the Olympics in Sydney. I believe, if I'm correct factually, the predominant flag bearers were from canoe and kayak sprint. So we had Canada, I think, had an athlete, and there were some other countries as well. Norway had their kayaker there. But anyway, so, when it came to an honorable experience, that was it. But on a sporting level, I remember it wasn't at the Olympic Games, but it was at a World Championship event where I was actually racing outrigger canoes for a team in Hawaii. And the experience was extremely painful experience, but the reward was exhilarating. I remember I was cramping from head to toe coming in the last mile of the race, but I knew it was there, and I knew I could see the finish line with my teammates that I was racing with. So, there's all these various different moments we have in sports. Some are great and some are not, but I think that it's a learning experience that we get from these moments that provide us that thirst and that opportunity to be able to get to the top.
Yeah, that's huge. How many people know Olympic flag bearers in the Olympic? I mean, that's just when I first learned that, Cliff, and just actually kind of recently, within the last 5 years, my dad told me, and my dad's only, my dad's heavily involved, John Nunn, as you know, Olympic, medalist and coach in rowing. But my dad rarely, he says these people are famous, and the only couple times I've heard him get really excited were of Louis Zamperini, right? And everyone knows Louis, right? Yeah. And I remember walking up and, you have to meet this guy, and I'm like, this must be huge, because my dad, he usually is calm, and then he's like, you have to meet them, and then meet him. But Louis was a big one, and then you. And he's like, Cliff, he carried the flag at the Olympic ceremonies, and he was 2-time Olympian, and you got to meet this guy, so he gets very excited. So those are the only two people. So I don't know if you knew that, but now you know.
Your dad's awesome. He's been a motivator for me for many years.
Yeah. And like something that you said too, for the listeners out there in our sport, because it's a water sport, rowing, and even though they're different, they're similar in the fact, here's a similarity, yes, very dominated by Europeans, rowers in the United States. And I think this is humbling and actually cool in the aspect that a lot of I shouldn't say other sports, but the US is dominant in a lot of sports. But since rowing and kayaking are involved more, like they're taken on by more countries, it's harder, and they're just better. They start younger. There's more infrastructure there for that kind of development of rowers and kayakers. So,
right, they have a very large. You go into countries like as in rowing as well. Britain's big. Rowing has a massive history. It goes way back, even on the collegiate standpoint as well. But for kayaking, our development process is much different than in Europe. It's a very club-based system on the rivers, and you've got countries like Germany, Hungary, Italy, France. A lot of the old Eastern Bloc countries are very dominant. But the United States has done very well in the past. One of my heroes in paddling and has been a huge motivator for me was Greg Barton. He's done what some Olympians have never done, winning a gold medal in the singles 1,000 and turning around 90 minutes later and doing it in the doubles. Greg was a big inspiration, to me, and he paddled in all different facets, not only Olympics, but he was in outrigger canoeing, marathon canoeing, and so we've done very well, but predominantly it's very European dominated. Yeah,
for sure. So a lot of people may not know this, but you kind of hinted on the accent you had and walking like Bambi, but I think I would be walking like Bambi even without an accent carrying the flag, because I hear your nerves and the nervousness about that. That's very true. Yeah. When it's just such excitement, it's like you can't stop shaking. But what happened, for those listeners that are tuning in, what happened in your accident and what were the lasting effects?
Yeah, so what happened is that, after my initial stint in outrigger canoe paddling, I kind of took some steps back and I was really focused on, my soccer and played a lot with my father and did a lot of that. But I was working in Manhattan Beach and I got offered a job in construction. And at that time I was going to junior college and kind of doing the normal path. And this was a couple of years after I graduated from high school. So this was in 1986. And so I was offered a job, as I mentioned before. I think one of the big traits that I learned from my folks was all about hard work and determination. So I was always a very hard worker. And these guys noticed it and they got me into the trades. I was invited to work for this construction company, and the main focus was industrial plumbing. So we were laying huge water lines, domestic water lines. So I was working around a lot of heavy equipment and things like that. It wasn't a residential type of plumbing job. But so I got involved, worked there for a couple of years. They knew that I was a hard worker. I got involved in an apprenticeship program. And then one day I was operating a jackhammer. It was a normal line of work that I had done. As everybody knows, you got to pay your dues. And I was operating a jackhammer when I struck power lines that were buried beneath this concrete. And it was a life and death experience for me. I received an enormous electrical shock, ended up having a cardiac arrest, and I was very lucky. I was brought back to life. My mom always says, I guess you can't kill a weed, right? You're here for a reason. But, I was brought back to life, but the life of Cliff Meidl had completely changed. I was burned over 15% of my body, massive exit wounds on the back of my head. My back had huge exit wounds, but most of the damage came to both of my knee compartments where I came in contact with this jackhammer. I was locked onto this thing for about 20 seconds. So there was an enormous amount of damage that was done to my body. And this was a long lasting effect, especially for my family at the time. We all, face various different adversities that we go through in life. I always like to say, you never can judge a book by its cover. We don't know who's going through what difficulty in life or what adversity they may face. But I know at that time, our family had faced a lot of drama. My parents were not experienced in the medical business. And here my mother gets this telephone call from the job foreman saying that, Cliff was involved in this horrific accident. And then he follows it up with, well, we don't know if he's going to live. So that's something that a mom or any family member is worst nightmare. And I remember my mom coming to the hospital, and that's when my family had learned about the significant injuries that I had. But there was a point in time in my 3.5-month hospital stint where I was going to lose both of my legs. And the story goes that, I was at a burn ward for about a month, and my dad was coming up in the elevator. And these elevator doors open up, and here these 3 doctors walk in with their white coats. And they were doing their normal clinical chit chat until this one doctor said, "Hey, did you hear about the kid up in the intensive care unit, the one that received those electrical burns?" And that is when my dad knew that our family was in a world of hurt, because the doctor said then, well, they're probably going to have to do bilateral amputations on the kid's legs. And so you can imagine when that news got up to my mom, there's one thing that you never, ever tell a mom is no. For my mother, it was like hearing the word on, so she, I think at that young age that my mother had to really navigate our family through this entire process without any experience. She did a resilient job being able to climb mountains that would never have been climbed. And if my mom couldn't climb the mountain, she'd go around it and try to find an alternative. But long and short of the story is that defying the odds, she met this doctor, and heroes come in our lives in various different stages, and mentors. And she met this guy out of UCLA, Dr. Malcolm Lesevoy, and he was invited to come down to the hospital and do an analysis on both of my legs. And he essentially saved both legs by removing my calf muscles and being able to flop them on top of that huge area of my knee compartment. I was missing about a third of the bone in both legs. So running was over with for me. I was trying to save my legs from amputation at the time. And here this man comes along. I remember late one night, I was in my hospital bed. I had a cast all the way up to my hips because, with burn survivors, your highest risk is infection. And here this man comes into my hospital room wearing jeans, cowboy boots, and this white t-shirt with these huge, massive guns, these biceps. And he does something very unique. He says hello to my mother because he's met her before, but he walks straight up to my bed, puts his hand on my shoulder and said, "Hey, Cliff, I'm Mal Lesevoy, and I'm here to take a look at your legs." Not Dr. Malcolm Lesevoy, Mal Lesevoy. And I can, our audience can probably really imagine this is when you're going through adversity, especially a traumatic experience that's between life and death, like many may face every day, or what I had faced at the time, I had absolutely zero hope in my mind that I was ever going to be able to walk, let alone save my legs. And this man comes into my life and provides just this little flame of hope in my heart that maybe I can get through it. And it ended up being a life-changing experience because not only did he save my legs, he became a huge, huge mentor for me going through my rehabilitation. And he basically told me that, I've done my surgical procedure, my 50%, you need to come up with the rest of the equation. And I didn't understand as a young man what that meant. And what he was talking about was the will, the determination, and the resilience that it takes to get through adversity. And he challenged me and he says, you're never going to be the same as you were before, but what you can do is make yourself that much better. Use the tools that you have and don't worry about what you don't. So Dr. Lesevoy was just a huge inspiration, great friend of mine, even today. He's an awesome, awesome guy. And I've had an incredible, honorable opportunity to be able to speak with him side by side during a medical conference, which was just absolutely incredible for me. But, essentially that's what had happened in my accident. So here I was, left at my will, and my brother, 4 years younger, who would ever think that a younger brother can be inspiration? But, family dynamic is extremely important, especially when you're going through an adversity, because it just doesn't affect the individual. It affects the entire family. And my brother Norman really stepped up to the plate. He noticed I was getting depressed. But, the doctors were telling me at that time, you need to do rehab 3 times. But I didn't listen to what the rest of the equation was. It was 3 times a week, but I took it into my mind 3 times a day. So I would go to the gym and lift weights like crazy, try to get that scrawny body from 140 pounds back up to 200 pounds where I was before. And so I was very determined to get through this. This was my only thing in life that I wanted to do, was to get through the adversity and just be a normal kid. And I had to dream of being able to walk again. And so Norm comes up with this crazy idea. Let's go paddle canoes at the canoe club. And I thought to myself, are you crazy? Why would I want to go down to a canoe club? All these girls and guys, they're experts at what they do. They're really buff and fit. Why would a kid that's completely ashamed of himself want to go down to the canoe club? So my brother essentially told me, look in the mirror. And the only thing I could see at that time were lower leg limitations. But what he was trying to get me to understand and believe that it's not my lower legs, it's the tools that I have, which was to strengthen my upper body from using these crutches, because I left the hospital in a wheelchair. And then ultimately I was able to migrate onto crutches and so on and so forth. And so he gets me to go down to this canoe club. And I think that at the end of the day, and if you were to take the tape, because always, we see a point in time for people, we see success, but what we don't see is the hard work, the determination, and more importantly, all of the defeat that happens through that process. And I always like to say that, we see a lot of these people, we have heroes, mine, Michael Jordan, we always see people like that at the pinnacle, but what we don't see is the ability for them to be able to manage manage all the failures that they had in life. When they got knocked down on their butt, it's all about being able to stand up, dust yourself off, and if you can't get over the mountain, find a way how you're going to get around the mountain, right? That's how it is. And that's the reason why we become successful, is because we develop a thirst to be able to accomplish that goal. And it's all about the resilience. It's learning that you can't do it and then working hard and just taking the million steps that it takes in order to get to your goal is where you learn that resilience. And so I got involved in the canoe club, and I'll speed this up. And so I look back today and I ask myself, what did this club, what did canoeing and kayaking really provide for me and provide for this young man going through this huge adversity? And I look back and I say, okay, I developed a huge friend base, right? And that was great. I was involved in a family culture, the ohana, which means family in Hawaiian. That prospered a lot for me. I became the fittest I've ever in my life. In fact, I raced at many world championships, and I had these incredible Olympic opportunities and so on and so forth. I did well in many races, but I think that the number one most important part of the entire process was the inclusion. Nobody ever, under any circumstance, ever judged me for who I was. Day one, when I showed up as a guppy, having these crutches that I had with these huge leg immobilizers, and them my coach having to lift me into the canoe, all the way to being able to go to the Olympic Games. It's a process. But I think the most important part of that process is that we all, as human beings, need to go somewhere where we are accepted, and it provides us the opportunity to be the best that we can be. We don't have to be champions. We just have to be a part of a process. And that's what cultures really feed us. And it provides that growth that we need as young men and women to be able to really get, to where we want to go in life. And we use these tools in order to fight against these battles that we have throughout our life, whether it's sport, education, whatever it may be.
Yeah, wow. That's you just hit on so many things. I was like, yes. The ohana, one of them, it hits home to me because I did the Ultraman last year, and their whole thing is ohana. Yeah. We prayed and got together as a family, and we're all together in this, right? I think now, as a culture in this COVID crisis, we're all in this together. That's the message too, and bringing people forward and trying to help each other. Another thing you really hit on is in rowing and sport, for sure, teamwork, right? You're all included, and you're only as strongest as your weakest link, and making everyone feel included, and that's huge. And then one my father hit on, and which you hit on in a way, is focusing on your goal and managing, but focus and getting there. So all these things. And then I also recognize that you quoted your mother, not going up the mountain, but going around it, and finding a way. Yeah. And my mom's quote was from my whole life, I thought it was her quote, but it's not. It's a guy, it's Mike Garrett, a USC Heisman Trophy winner in the 60s. And he said, if you're going to do something, do it well, do it right, and finish it. And it's pretty simple, but that's from Mike Garrett. And I thought it was from my mom the whole time. I'm like, so anyway. I remember a quote that was told to me from when I did a lot of martial arts when I was younger. And I had, I pulled a lot of these role models, as I talked to you before, that were, big influencers for me. They probably didn't know that they were providing that influence. When I was doing my coaching stint in canoe paddling, I always told the guys, be humble. You never know what kid or adult is looking up to you, because we have role models all across the board. They don't have to be older than you. You can be inspired by people that are much younger than you. So it's all across the board. My brother was huge in my life and still is today as we speak. But I remember that I learned this one quote. It says, winners never quit, quitters never win. There is no such thing as an overachiever, just an underestimator. And I learned a lot from that, especially when I was going through my struggles in life. I remember my first coach, Bob Bice, down at the canoe club. He's that ripped up guy. And he was a huge inspiration for me during that phase and time in my life. And I learned a lot from it. And I remember I was very discouraged because I couldn't compete with everybody because, I was a guppy. I was new in the sport. I had my lower leg limitations, but he knew and identified that I really wanted it. And I remember he pulled me to the side and he said, Cliff, listen,
I can teach anybody technique, but what I cannot teach is the intensity. And I can see it in your eyes that you really want it. And that's how it is in life. You know, there are some people that are intense and you could see it in their eyes that they want to accomplish that goal. Are they going to do it? That's not a part of the question. It's all about the thirst and the learning process that we get through making these huge challenges in our life that I believe are so important and that really shape our character to who we are today.
Yeah. And a big reason why, you know, I'm doing this podcast and I'm honored to have such you and all these influential people on here, and is because waking up every day, we don't really have these coaches are telling us every day, you know, to get us motivated. As adults, we kind of have to dig deep within from our tools that we've learned. And coaches every day in a university or national team, they're talking to us, they're coaching you, and all of a sudden you don't have one, you have to resonate. So I felt like, man, I should start something where I'm creating something where I'm talking to people and I'm getting coached, I'm being influenced and inspired, because this past year of all the stuff I was doing, I had to dig real deep. And I think a lot of people now, especially now, have to dig real deep. And sports has such a very similarity between life and what things go on and just lifestyles. So I think it's really great. Moving forward, obviously we touched on, you know, kayaking helping you to rehabilitate, but when did you decide to try out for the Olympics? I mean, when was that moment?
Yeah, that moment was back in 1990. I remember Greg Barton was doing the Catalina to Newport Beach, which is a local outrigger race that we have here in Southern California. And he was on the winning team, and they were passing out this award, which was the most inspirational paddler. And I remember that I had received that award at that time. We had another fellow that I went to high school with, and that paddled on our canoe club, and he was getting involved in sprint kayaking. He already had made the national B team. And I remember I really wanted, especially seeing Greg race in the Olympics in '88 in Seoul. It was a huge inspiration for not only myself, but many other Southern California or across the globe paddlers. And so I really wanted to get into the sport. And I remember my friend telling me, okay, here, take this kayak, go down to Marina del Rey, which is a harbor close by us. It has a lot of flat water compared to Redondo Beach. The water is really swirly. And these boats are like balancing a ball bearing. You know, you sit in and you're out in the water, just like that. Very difficult. There's a huge learning curve, which people don't understand. And so he told me that go down there, and when you can balance the boat, come paddle with us in Redondo Beach. And so that was my initial introduction to the sport, of course, watching the Olympic Games with Greg racing at that time. But that was my physical introduction to it. And I remember, boom, I was in the water. And wait a second, I had already paddled for a few years in the canoe, and I also did a sport called surf skiing. How can this sport be possibly so difficult, right? So I blew up this inflatable tire. I stuffed it into the back of this kayak so it wouldn't sink in the water. And I paddled in Marina del Rey, and I was determined to overcome the stability, or the instability, if you want to call it that, of the boat. And then that's essentially how I got into paddling. And ironically, several of my teammates down at the canoe club, we raced together and kind of went up through the ranks of kayaking. And that's how I was introduced to the sport.
Yeah, I always tell people, it's so funny you talk about the imbalance and the kayak, and people are probably thinking, oh, I don't think the ocean kayak is that unstable. It's totally different than ocean kayak. And my story was, I was telling Cliff before the interview started, is that bringing up a photo shoot I had to do with rowing, and they also said, hey, by the way, do you know how to do K1 kayaking? And I was like, what is K1? Is that like an ocean, you know? And I asked my dad, and I asked Chris Swan, a fellow national team, also Olympic kayaker and rower. And he goes, you better practice, because you're going to make yourself like a fool and you're not going to get through that photo shoot. And I was like, no, I'll be okay. And I remember, here I am, rower, single, sculler, right? So the single is 27 feet long. It's as wide as your hips, the widest point. And I remember sizing up. I did the rowing first. I sized up the K1. I'm looking at the K1. I'm like, oh, that looks a little skinny. I don't know, you know. So I do the rowing first. They get the footage. They're like, wow, that was great. So I get to the K1, and I was like, let me just go out for a little tryout. First time in K1. You'd be proud, Cliff. I managed to do okay, but they asked me to go faster and faster and faster and more intensity. and get closer to them because they're taking photos.
Yeah.
And man, I flipped, like, just boom. Like, and that was the first time I flipped in years. And I remember going, wow, this is much, much harder than people think. And even as a rower single sculler, it just takes practice. It's different, but very tippy. If you lean one side, you're going to go in. You got to use almost like the paddle to balance,
Yeah. The learning curve is really, I mean, if you're coming from rowing or a water sport, typically you do well. I mean, you get into the boat, there may be a few times where you're having instability issues, but you always have that. And, there's a very steep learning curve. You get into it, do well, but then we find that there's a big plateau in the sport. You've got to, it takes years, and we're not talking 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. It takes a lot of years to be able to get down the sport, because there's a combination of, not only is the boat unstable, but it's a high performance sport. So there's an enormous amount of strength, aerobic capacity, and speed. It's track and field on the water. And so you have to combine all of that and the technical element of the stroke and the components of that. And that's what makes it such a difficult sport. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely different. And so we talked about your Olympics, and then you were in '96 in Atlanta and also Sydney. And by the way, for people listening in, those are centennial Olympics. For people who don't know, Athens was supposed to be the centennial, but they couldn't get their act together. So Not only did you carry the flag, but you carried it during the centennial games. You were part of that movement, so which was huge.
Yeah, that was the centennial was Atlanta. And then 4 years later in Sydney, I was a flag bearer in Sydney. Yeah, but it was great being a part of that, especially on home turf. I always tell the story that, first of all, when you're at the Olympics, you can't believe you're there, and it's just like all of this stuff, years and years and years and years of training. And then all of a sudden the moment happens, and 2 weeks later it's over with, right? And I remember walking in the opening ceremonies in Atlanta, my coach is kind of grabbing onto me. We had to go down this big ramp, and it was almost like blood was my blood in my body was like oil. Everything was slow motion and deja vu. And I had this dream as a young kid. When I used to run down the ramp at PE, I would dream I was competing in this large arena, but I never knew what it was. Was it going to be soccer or what? It's a kid's dream. And all of a sudden that deja vu came to reality during that opening ceremony. I remember 200,000, screaming USA, Americans chanting USA. It was the Olympics is always a very exhilarating experience. It's awesome being able to represent the country.
It's so awesome. It's so incredible. I mean, my dream growing up was obviously to make the Olympics, growing up with a father and filling that shoe, and then also to make it to the Kona Ironman World Championships, which I got to do last year, and I'll never do that again because it's just way too hard to qualify. But same thing, you just try and take it in, and you just smile. And I remember just before that, I was nervous, but I was just trying to take it all in, and so moving forward, what have you been doing to give back and help others avoid what happened to you, as far as going back to that accident and moving forward after the Olympic Games?
Yeah, that's a great question. So after I retired in the Olympic Games, for the last 25 years, and this was also before the Olympics, I have a background in finance, and I work for a family business in Los Angeles, and I've been involved in that for many years. But also, to go to your question, is after the Olympic Games, I was invited to speak at this event, and this guy saw me on TV carrying the flag, and he knew I was in a construction accident, so he invited me back to Chicago, and he says, "Would you mind doing a speech for a group of people?" So I thought to myself, "Oh my goodness, I'm nervous. I don't do public speaking. Okay, I'll come back there." So I go to Chicago, and I walk out on stage, 1,100 people, right? I'm having flashbacks to the opening ceremony. And I remember, first time out there speaking in a big public arena, a lot of trips and falls. But I committed to myself that I want to be a good public speaker. And so that's when I got involved in speaking. I started speaking a lot in the safety industry and in the construction industry. trying to really kind of go and provide that give back, because I always say that if I can inspire just one person within the room, whether the audience is one person or 15,000, if I can inspire one person to go out there and be the best that they can be, and especially when it comes to safety, if I could get them to be able to go home as safe as they came to work to their families, I essentially have done my job. So I think that, my motto is the give back, I think is a critical component, no matter what we do or what facet in life is, because, we all went through hardship. Some people had more, as I talked about, adversity and trauma, and some people have less. But I think the important thing is that as we get older, develop character, develop that knowledge, and develop that wisdom, more importantly, I think the greatest reward is being able to turn around and reach out to somebody, whether it's our community or another individual that's going through hardship, and be able to provide them that little bit of flame of hope in their heart that they're going to be able to get through that adversity. That has been my motto ever since, I was a young kid and through the Olympic Games. And, oftentimes when I do speeches, I travel the country and I do speeches on the safety standpoint now for the last 20 years. And I think that, a lot of times, people will ask, what's your Olympic medal like? And, obviously the response is, well, I didn't win an Olympic medal, but I had the most incredible honor carrying the flag of the United States. But I think that, me personally, I think my Olympic medal that I won is the medal in life to be able to go back and inspire people to be the best that they can be. And if I can save people's lives on the construction side, if they just go back and say, you know what, I remember hearing that story about that kid that got in that electrical accident, and that's the whole thing about it, is if we can just get people to realize and be aware and have that 30,000 foot approach when they walk through life and be able to be safe at all times. I think that is my Olympic medals, being able to have the opportunity to be able to create that awareness. And I think that is a critical component, being able to have that opportunity to be able to go back and do that. And it's a very rewarding experience, and I enjoy it and love it.
No, that's amazing. And that part of the podcast is the legacy, right? And Cliff, yeah, your legacy is obviously being an Olympian, but also giving back through your, what you've done and what you've been through. And that's awesome. And that's the whole story, the whole premise of this podcast is giving back. And for me, it was my dad coaching me. I'm coaching kids, leading people through, fitness classes, but also telling stories. We're on Olympic. We have Olympic history in Long Beach. We have Olympic history in Los Angeles, 84. We all grew up here. We have so many Olympians surrounding us and so much inspiration. And so moving forward with this, do you have any stories about visiting? This is my dad, where he gets emotional, and he brings up something, but you probably know what it is on this question. But do you have any stories about visiting accident victims and trying to help them recuperate from traumatic injuries?
Well, I've had some small experience in the past where I remember this was early on. I was invited to go speak at a burn camp in Colorado, which is a very large organization. And I remember going to this organization and I'm thinking to myself, okay, I've got my speech lined up. I had the opportunity of providing the keynote address. And when I got there, I was so intimidated because of the fact that what I had gone through was just a blip compared to what these people were facing in their lives, their long-term adversity that they not only had at that one point in time, the traumatic experience, but how they carried this through the rest of their life. The young kids that were burned over 80% of the body, and all these people that were going through hardship. And I remember at that point in time, I really learned how important it is to be able to go out there and make a difference, because everybody has their own story and some people have gone through worse experiences than others, but it really doesn't matter because it's all about going through adversity. And we find that one of the commonalities in life is that we all resource a lot of those very similar tools. We may have a slightly different pathway how we go through it, but we utilize a lot of those basic tools when we go through hardships in life. And I talk about that, we have these various different stages that we go through of grievance. We have different models that each and every one of us use, if you want to call it a hierarchy of being able to achieve your goal, whether it's being visionary or whether it's being the best that you could be, or whether it's identifying, what are my strengths and weaknesses, or what are my patterns of success. We all have these little elements that we find many years later when we look back that we have. But I think that, that for me was one of the most emotional times that I've experienced that was very large. Oftentimes when I do presentations, there are people in the audience, especially in the construction business, that come up and say, hey, I lost my arm working on a job site. And, it brought me back what you were talking about to the experiences that I had. And I think that's one of the great therapeutic values that we have in life. If we can share our stories, and stories, they go a long way. We can be trained in things. We can learn about procedure. We can become educated. But what really resonates with us as humans is stories, these inspirational stories in life. And if we could identify by those and be inspired by them, and, every day myself, I get inspired by people's stories, and that's what keeps me going. And that's how life works. And I think that, from time to time, I get to cross that bridge, being involved in various different functions and organizations that allow for that opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. That's the whole reason, again, coming back to it. I mean, the stories my coaches told me, mentors told you, my father, everything, just all coming together. And if you could define yourself in 3 words, what would they be?
I would definitely say determined, because once I get something in my mind and I want to accomplish it, I'm going to do it. Whether it's sport or whether it's been academics in the past, which have been a big challenge, but you get through these processes. And so I think definitely determination when it comes to that. Also, I think that mentorship is critical. I mean, it really defines who I am. And I really try to be able to create that mirror image when I do present to other people, how important it is to be able to grab onto somebody. We don't necessarily have to reinvent the wheel as we walk through life. We just have to identify what other people have done and maybe tweak it a little bit and make it, our own to ourselves. And then I think that, what defines me now, it's taken a long time to learn this, is to be able to accept who I am. I can't compare against you. You have your strengths, and I'm never going to be able to compete in the same ground as you are, or anybody else in life. And I think that we really need to be aware that, just go out there and be the best that you can be. We have one chance in life, and never under any circumstance let anybody ever tell you, no, you cannot do it. We've all had that experience in life. I've had people tell me that I was never, ever going to make it in sport, or I was never, ever going to make it in school. But the fact of the matter is just be the best that you can be. Love what you do, and it's not driven by money. It has to be driven by passion. And I think that's the most important thing in my life. So I guess those 3 important things, right?
Huge, yeah. Yeah, no, it's very, very straightforward and powerful. And and on that note, I think you talked about before the doctor that saved your legs, but who have been the biggest, most significant influences and inspiration in your life? I mean, besides obviously the doctor you told us about, but who else in your life?
Yeah, I think that, as you go through life, your various different, stages in your life as you go through your experiences, as I mentioned before, that was my skill set, was being able to dream about wanting to be like this person or that person and really trying to attach. I would definitely say my parents. I learned a lot from my mom and dad. It was that hard work. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. My parents really learned and taught me at a young age, you got to work hard. And my mom, even today, and my dad, very hard workers. My mom's theory, if there was time to lean, there's time to clean, right? So that's how she had that mentality. But, there was various different elements. When I was a young kid, 2 blocks away from my house, I used to throw newspapers. That's what kids did at that time. We all had paper routes to this one guy whose name is Tom Hintnaus. He's, a famous Olympic. He's a 2-time Olympian in the sport of pole vaulting. He's more known for his Calvin Klein, famous Calvin Klein ad during the 1980s. But, Tom he's a friend of mine, and, he really motivated me as a young kid to be able to go out there. I watched him run by with the Olympic torch. I remember he was involved in that whole Olympic movement as the, 80 Olympics and 84 Olympics were in Los Angeles. And I remember that, he was a big role model for me. And I remember there was one moment that as a young kid, I was doing track and field at my high school, and I wanted to have him come down because he set the record for pole vaulting. And I remember knocking on his door, asking him if he would come down and help. And of course, I was the hero at that time with my friends. Okay, you got Tom to come down to school. Unfortunately, the day that he was going to come down to school, it was raining.
Oh.
Rain doesn't mix with pole vault. But Tom showed up, and he says, here's what we're going to do. The basketball players aren't going to be happy, but what he did is he got us to wax the floor in the gymnasium, and he was showing us with the pole that we would do our exit at the top of the vault, and we would slide across the floor of the gymnasium at high school. And it was, all these different stages in life, whether it was Tom, Dr. Lesavoy, my parents, my brother Norman, some of the people that were my heroes in martial arts and things like that. You all learn from, it's all a piece of the pie that makes you who you are today. And I learned a lot from these people and my coaches, and they've been big influences for me, even today. I mean, I can look back and tell you exactly that moment and that pinpoint in time where they provided that little bit of hope in my heart. I asked Dr. Lesavoy even today, do you remember when you told me that? And he's like, absolutely not, and it's one of the things that we learn is that's why it's so critical to be humble at all times. You don't know who's watching you. It's always good to be humble.
Yeah, I was just telling my dad yesterday after we did an interview, and I was telling him about people that come up to me or him and say, you really taught me a lot. And he's like, who are you again? And I've had these moments too where I'm like, I don't know who you are, and I'm really sorry. But you change their lives, and it's like, wow. And you make that big moment for them, or you change a path for them that's on the positive side. You teach them something new through experience, and at the same time, here's where that focus comes in, or what you're saying, management, as far as getting to your goal, working hard. I think those people are so driven that they're only paying attention to just one thing and not really details on who they're talking to. It's no offense to that, but it's just like they're so focused on driving that message. And so I think that's something that's interesting, Yeah.
Well, it comes to that with coaching, and you've experienced that probably in the past where there are two different coaches could say the same thing and one will really resonate and the other one will not. Everybody has their style. That's not saying that one coach, I guess there's great coaches and probably not so good coaches, but when you get into the higher echelon in sports and you really are able to have that opportunity to have those coaches, one coach can tell you one thing and the other coach can tell you the same, and all of a sudden it'll click just like that to you because what they said, the way they demonstrated, the inspiration behind it can be really, it can really click for you. And also that state of mind in your life at that time is where you can adapt and absorb to it. Yeah,
no, for sure. And I've definitely had those moments with coaches, and then coaches being genuine, you can tell, are passionate. And we had a couple coaches at Berkeley in rowing. Our freshman coach, Craig Armercanian, he turned into be the Stanford head coach, and then Steve Gladstone, who's now the Yale coach. Two different people, different messages. And I remember Gladstone trying to be a little bit like Craig, and I'm like, no, it's not right. And he noticed it wasn't really working. He's like, well, just stick with you, stick with what you know. And he did, and he does. But I remember him trying to be a little bit like Craig, and Craig trying to be, and it just doesn't work. It's like, no, you got to be your person. You got to have your style, and that will resonate. That will be genuine, and people know, they know if you're BSing or not. And that's the quality of that. So, and so moving forward, my last question, maybe just going back to that legacy, but also, what are you working on now? We all know, by now. You're working on, tell us more about the 811, and then, but what you're working on now and what you're most looking forward to in the future.
Yeah, I think that what I'm working on right now, I'm always working on the project. My lifelong commitment is being able to go out there and inspire people to be the best and work safe. So I've been, the last, I think 10 years, I've been working a lot with the damage prevention industry, which is to call 811 before you dig. I'm one of the ambassadors in that community. So I'm trying to always stay on the forefront. I'm involved in these various different panels at conferences, along with doing, my motivational talk that I do. So you always kind of want to stay on top of things on an article standpoint and be present in the industry. But as you know, times are challenging now. We're in the unknown with the pandemic that has gone around globally. So a lot of us have had to resort to doing the various different webinars, podcasts, and really creating that presence and being out there. And I think that's a really important part of it. I try to stay as best as I can at my aging age with social media. It's a challenge. It could be done much better. But I think that, once we get through this, I think we'll be back to business as usual, I hope, where we can actually go out there, because nothing ever replaces tangibly being in front of an audience, where they can really get the feel and the emotion of really what you're trying to portray. Yeah, so those are some of the things I'm working with today. I'm still very, very busy working with the family operation that I'm a vice president with, and I love that. I enjoy that line of work. So I've got a lot of balls in the air. And then I think that my biggest mission in life was to go back, to your legacy question. How do you create this legacy? I've got a daughter that just turned 9 years of age. And, I'm trying to delicately walk through that process. I know what I want her to do, but she's her own individual. So I'm really trying to, I don't want to say I'm trying to push things to her, but, I want to introduce as a father to her as best as I can. And I think that one of the things that really shaped me with my determination and respect growing up was definitely the martial arts. So I have my daughter doing that right now. She's doing her jiu-jitsu, and I see that it's really great, especially for a shy person like myself when I was younger. And same thing with her. But then also, you gotta do the introduction to paddling, right? When is that gonna come? So I'm trying to, she's 9. I've had her in the back of a kayak before. I don't want to push her and all that. Now it's like, hey, you want to go take a look at some of the seals and all that? But ultimately, as you know, with your intensity, that migration has got to get into trying to get her into the sport if she's going to like it. But everybody's their own individual. I guess as parents, the best thing that we can do is give them the tool sets, and then they can set their own pathway. But she's very smart, very good kid.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, it's, as you know, I come from a big family, and my dad had 4 daughters, God bless him, before he had me. And apparently when I came along, he was like, yes, but yeah, my intro to rowing was very chance. I mean, I came home one day and I said, I'm going to quit soccer and baseball. That's it. And my dad looked at me with a straight face, and he said, okay, well, either you find something else to do or you get a job. And I was like, well, I don't want a job right now, but how about maybe that rowing thing? And he ran up, called the coach so fast. I was like, whoa, hold on a second. Yeah. But again, it's that going back to that community. I think if you, it's just got to come natural. I'm not going to tell you what to do at all, but it's just the natural feel. But I think the community and the opportunity is a big one. And I think with kayaking, canoe, rowing, as you know, women's sports, huge, Title IX, the opportunity for all that. And then, and your legacy and your influence. But yeah, it's delicate because it's a big shoe to fill. There's some pressure, but my dad was pretty good about I created that pressure, of course, but he was pretty good about trying not to, and I let him know, hey, you got to step back, or hey, you're doing too much, and it was a delicate process. And in that, I found I didn't make it to the biggest stage on rowing. I wasn't the national team, but I made my passion through other things, through multi-sport. So, so I think that was, my own path. But hey, that's amazing that all these stories and all this just resonates so much with me, and I hope it does with our listeners. And I'm just honored to have you, Cliff, and as a great friend of our family, and just inspiration, just so much. And you've inspired me, big time, mind blowing. So where can people find you on social media, and how can they follow you and get in touch?
First of all, they can always go to my website, cliffmeidl.com, and they can see a little bit of history. On YouTube, I don't have a channel, but you could YouTube my story on there. There's a lot of videos that they have done, Olympic side of it, and then there's a lot of videos they have done through the work safe part about it. And I have a Facebook page. You could go to, just type in Cliff Meidl. You can go there. I'm on Twitter as well, and now trying to get onto Instagram. So
yeah, it's a whole new world, and now it's all these other social media, TikTok. And so I'm like, let's calm down, people. Let's just keep it. And then I definitely would recommend, because I was looking through a bunch of videos last night. They're very inspirational, very professional, for anyone looking at more of Cliff Meidl's story, to go on YouTube and just to punch in your name, and all these great stories come up. You're on ABC Good Morning America. You're showing off your Rio jacket, your Olympic jacket, the glow in the dark jacket.
Yeah, we did that 2 years ago for the Olympic Games in Rio. Or wait, 4 years ago. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
so we went to New York, and as everybody knows, Ralph Lauren does all the U.S. Olympic uniforms. So the first time ever, they created an illuminated jacket for the flag bearer. And everybody knows Michael Phelps carried the flag in Rio. And so as soon as he walked out with the American flag, the back of it illuminated. So I was on the Today Show, and they had us display that, which was a great opportunity. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, and just a bunch of other videos from Safety 811, which is awesome. People overlook this stuff. It's like, oh, why should I? There's a lot of stuff under the ground, and also just inspiring stories about kayaking and moving forward. So again, it's a pleasure to have you, Cliff, and I'm learning as I go here with just some new podcasts here. But I want to continue this, and through this crisis that we're going on now, I think everyone needs a little hope and inspiration, whether it comes from wherever it comes from. But how about Olympic heroes? How about someone overcoming some serious adversity and just learning from that? So thank you, Cliff, again. And
I appreciate it.
Yeah, and we'll hope to see you soon. And I'll see you on the water, hopefully, sometime Redondo Beach. People try and get me to come down there and kayak, and so thanks again. And for everyone out there, you can follow us on the Legacy Roworx Podcast. We're just starting out. This is our 3rd episode. Again, thanks, and we'll talk to you soon. Thanks again.
All right, thanks, Jack. Take care.
All right, you too.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us this week on the Roworx Legacy Podcast. Make sure to visit www.roworx.com, where you can subscribe to the show on iTunes, Spotify, and all other major streaming platforms. While you're at it, if you found value in this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, or that you simply tell a friend about us. Remember to be inspired, stay positive, stay active, and leave a great legacy while blazing a trail for others to follow. Be sure to tune in next week for our next episode.